Welcome to Filibusted. Today we are going to be equal opportunity offenders because we will be discussing one of the most controversial topics of our time. We're going to be saying all things Israel today, and whether you support Israel or you oppose Israel, I'm sure one of us will have something to say that will offend you, or also something that you'll probably like as well. So stick around. Like I said, we're equal opportunity offenders this morning, and we're covering international pressure on Israel. We're going to be discussing in depth the Israel and Palestine conflict and also the possibility of the U.S. dropping its support of Israel, current U.S. Trump administration relations to Israel. So strap in because we are on this rocky ride together. Okay, this week, several U.S. allies threatened Israel with sanctions. So last Friday, Israel launched a new offensive campaign into the Gaza Strip. And this Monday, Prime Minister Netanyahu said that their plan is to take over the entire Gaza Strip. And they're doing this so they can completely eliminate Hamas, Netanyahu says, for the sake of Israel's security. And he also stated that he will allow minimal aid into Gaza, and he expressed concern about a possible famine starting in Gaza, and that's why he wants to allow minimal aid. And he also said that if Israel allows for a famine to happen in Gaza, it will make Israel lose all of its international support, and it will end their mission to destroy Hamas. So Netanyahu was saying we really can't allow this to happen, but at the same time, he was very strictly saying we're only letting in minimal amounts of aid. So UK, France, and Canada, they responded this week by threatening Israel with sanctions because they want Israel to lift all the restrictions on aid. So that way a potential famine doesn't happen in Gaza and aid can still come in to the civilians in Gaza. And they also want Israel to strike a ceasefire with Hamas and stop attacking Gaza. They don't like Israel's plan we're going to keep attacking Gaza until we eliminate all of Hamas. They're like, hey, you've killed a lot of the Hamas's leadership. You crippled them. You should just stop and pull out of Gaza so no more people don't die. And so this famine doesn't potentially happen. That's the international community pressure that is on Israel right now. And so there's a lot of pressure mounting on Israel. Most of the international community does not like Netanyahu's plan to wipe out all of Hamas. They don't think it's really possible or feasible. But then, of course, if you look at it from Netanyahu's perspective, so they're worried about a genocide happening in Gaza. That's what they're worried about. In fact, a lot of people have already accused Israel of basically setting up a genocide or perpetrating a genocide, which we will get into that. But if you look at it from the Netanyahu's perspective, my analysis is that the reason he wants to do this is because he thinks that if they stop going after Hamas and say, all right, we're going to pull out of Gaza, let all the international aid come in. Well, a lot of that international aid ends up going to Hamas, and they will be able to recoup and regather, and they might turn around and end up attacking Israel again, like they did in that October 7th attack that killed like 1,200 Israelis. And so that is the fear, and I believe that is the reason why Netanyahu and some Israel leaders are saying, no, we're just going to keep attacking Gaza until we wipe out all of Hamas. And like I said, international community is getting very tired of this. So let's talk casualties for a moment. So just so y'all know, in Gaza, there's currently estimated about 2 million people, and that strip has been self-governed since 2007 when Hamas took it over from Israel. And we'll get into a little bit more of the history later. So the casualties, since October 2023. So that was the day that Hamas launched an attack into Israel. And most of the casualties in Israel happened on that day. So they killed about 1,200 people, and those were mostly civilians. And that's most of the casualties that have happened in Israel. And also, there are still estimated about 50 hostages in Gaza, estimated about 50 that are still alive. Several have died in captivity. Now let's talk about Palestinian casualties. So in Gaza, the estimate is about 40,000 people have been killed. Now, this is a little sticky because Gaza does not distinguish between civilian deaths and combatant deaths when they do their death count. And so that 40,000, it's not exactly clear how many of those were civilians and how many were combatants. But the Gaza says 6,000 of them were women, 10,000 were children. Israel says that they've killed 17,000 Hamas soldiers. And so I honestly believe, especially with the 40,000, and that's also coming from the UN, those are pretty good estimates. And so we're kind of looking at, appears to be close to a 1-to-1 combat to civilian death ratio. So for every one Hamas combatant that's killed in Gaza, one civilian has been killed. One more casualty worth mentioning, because this just happened last night here in the United States of America in Washington, D.C., 2 Israel embassy staff members were actually murdered last night, leaving the Jewish museum there in D.C. by a guy who shouted "Free Palestine" while he was being arrested, and he murdered them, and he immediately turned himself in. So we'll get into some of the American politics and how the Israel-Palestine kind of bled over here in a little bit. But I want to open this up to you guys. So just to break up the conversation, first, we are talking Israel and Palestine from a ethical and historical perspective. Later on in the episode, we're going to talk American politics. We're going to talk America be supporting Israel. Should America be supporting Palestine? Should America be supporting any of Israel's conflicts? Should we be involved in the Middle East from an American perspective, because we're all American? And we're going to end with talking from a Christian perspective. Why do a lot of Christians support Israel? Should they support Israel? What's the spiritual religious arguments surrounding Israel and modern day sort of political support? And so getting off with the first section here, what do you guys think about Israel and Palestine from an ethical, historical perspective, and their current attacks on Gaza, their current operation that they have going on in Gaza to wipe out all of Hamas? Is it justified? Is it problematic? What do you guys think about it?
Well, before I actually answer the question and allow everyone else to answer the question, I want to insert something. This is what's I've been mulling over in my brain all morning, is the idea of, when it comes to ethics, and I'm setting politics aside, setting the spiritual view aside for a moment. But I feel like in today's world, we have a problem with ethical arguments, and it's because we can't separate them from what I just mentioned. We can't separate them from our other beliefs and our biases and our politics and our history, like what we're used to. It's very, very hard, I think, for us. So I'm just going to give you an example. Wizard of Oz. So you've got the story of the Wicked Witch of the West, and now today, and it was very clear, you got the good witch, you got the bad witch, right? In the original story. Now we've got Wicked coming out, and that's kind of representing the modern day view of, okay, here's this bad witch, right? The Wicked Witch, but she's really just misunderstood, so we've got this view, but now we've gone even past that. So it's not just like, okay, the bad person doing the bad stuff was misunderstood, but now it's, no, they're not misunderstood, but they're justified in being bad. So now you have the Disney coming out with all their villains, right? But instead of making their villains just misunderstood, in some cases they are misunderstood. In other cases, now we show, oh, they had a hard life, and now we're showing you why. But we're making them, why they're bad, but we're making them the hero. So now we're showing you that kind of they're justified in being bad because bad things have happened to them. So it's like this idea of ethics based on, well, injustice can lead to and be an excuse for more injustice, right? It's kind of like that idea. So I think that's the problem, where we've got all these biases and all these lenses that we look through. And so I would just start off the bat, I would encourage every person listening, and even the other hosts and myself as well, that we could look at this through a lens of, is this right or wrong? No matter which side is doing what, like no matter which side we prefer, is this right or is this wrong? And trying not to justify something based on a bias, based on a political perspective, or based on which side we're on, or even based on an injustice that's been done before. Because I firmly believe that injustice does not excuse more injustice. That's my initial statement, and then I'll get into a real answer in a minute. But what do y'all think?
So from a historical perspective, if I just literally historical perspective, who should have the land? And so there's a historical document that shares that 2,500 years ago, Persian King Cyrus in 538 BC said the exiles from Israel, they allowed the Jews to return to their land. And there's a historical document that verifies that. And there's multiple documents. One of them happens to be the book of Ezra in the Bible, and that's chapter 1, verse 2. But this is a historical document. And so if we start back there, we see that, okay, it's their land. Well, then they were removed again from the land. And then if you go back into the late 1800s, they were talking about this is their land. They need to be given back their land. And then you get into 1891. You have the U.S. president starting to talk about this with 413 signatures from different people around the U.S. Then you get into 1917. This is presented to Woodrow Wilson. And then you have the Balfour Declaration. And then in 1920, you have the League of Nations mandate. And Britain legally required the reestablishment of Israel to their biblical homeland, or the homeland is really what it is. And then you have Harry Truman involved. 1948 is when they actually, May 14th, 1948, the state of Israel was declared, and America was the first one to recognize that within 15 minutes. And then you have the continual issues after that, the Hamas and all the whatever it's called at the time, the people in that area that were of the Islamic faith and were against this, and all these, and Syria and Egypt and all these were not for this, and they never recognized them as a state. And so when we talk about what's really going on here, if you Gaza, they have never been a legitimate state. And then we should talk about just war theory. And there's several things that go into just war theory. We're not talking about a legitimate state versus another legitimate state. We're talking about a terrorist organization versus a legitimate state. Now, that doesn't mean Israel can go and do whatever they want to do, but it does mean that they have a right to this land. So this is really not about land. This is about, they don't want Israel to exist. They want to exterminate Jews. And we know this because if Israel stopped fighting, they would continue to come after the Jews. And if the terrorists in Gaza stopped fighting, there would be peace. And so that's exactly what I think is going on here. And so they need to be going about this. They need to be, I mean, the world is against them. The UN has vetoed hundreds of resolutions that were one-sided. And I mean, there's very few people standing with Israel. And I know we're going to get into the U.S. side of that here later. But my thought is, they have the land, it's their right, and there's terrorist attacks happening on them. They need to defend themselves. We can get into the details of how they should do that. But this is a legitimate, and the terrorist government is not legitimate.
Yeah, I think that like the complexity of the land issue is a little bit different. And to play devil's advocate a little bit, we could really go on the other side of that. Like, how do you know who gets what land, and like who gets to decide that and why? And that, to me, that's kind of a weaker argument, because you could go in circles all day long on that. But the point that you made about it being the fact that they want to exterminate Israel, that I think is the bigger issue at hand, because that's more like a topic of like genocide. Like, if Israel were to be left to their own devices, like if nobody wanted to exterminate Israel, they probably wouldn't be doing this. They probably would be just chilling and like trying to keep their land. But I know that the land is kind of it's still an issue, but I think that it's too easy to argue it. I don't disagree with you. I think you're right, but there's too much going on with that. I think the real issue at hand is that they just want to kill Israel.
And I should have made this point first, but it's important to point out that the Palestinian National Charter calls for the destruction of the state of Israel, and that has never been rescinded, and right. No one is insisting that it be rescinded. It's Article 9 of the Hamas Charter. I can read it for you if you would like, but that's what they want. I mean, it's no doubt, and so that's clear. I mean, where are the people calling out for Hamas or the Palestinian National Charter to actually just hey, let's start with recognizing Israel as a legitimate state. Let's start there,
or at least take off. We're going to destroy Israel. That's
right. Yeah,
maybe start with that one. Maybe
that's a good starting point. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I think you make a very good point, both Doug and Ryan. Intentions matter. What are you trying to do? What have you stated that you're trying to do? And I think that plays into the ethical argument. Because Ryan, I agree with Doug. I think more so. I agree with you, Ryan, historically speaking. But when it comes to the ethical argument today, one of the things that I've seen across the board is anyone that's not in support of Israel is essentially going to argue for what I would consider a rewritten version of history, but sort of, but also just a different perspective of looking at it. Because technically speaking, the Jewish culture and the Jewish group did not, they were not the majority in the land after a certain period. They were from, I think about when they, some historians will say that they came in originally around like 1400 BC or something like that. Other people say it was before that. But whenever it was, they were there for a couple thousand years, as the main people that owned the land, right? And then it was, I think, around 600 AD or something like that, when the Jewish diaspora began to happen for a second time or a third time, and they really began to disperse across the world. And obviously that happened initially, during the Roman occupation around 70 AD when the temple was destroyed, Jerusalem was destroyed. You saw kind of a dispersion happen then, but you saw another dispersion, a larger one happen later. And so there is this period of history where there's a lot of different ethnic groups, a lot of different people groups living in this land, and that would be between 600 AD and late 1800s, early 1900s, and so it's like you kind of see a lot of different people occupying the land. Now, when you're talking about all the nations of the world recognizing Israel as a state, Israel as a country in its own recognized government, and that's a different story. So I would say there's a good argument there. But how do you decide? How do you say, okay, well, they were here for this amount of time, and it was their land, someone dispersed them, somebody displaced them, and then now these people were here, and the Jews were there as well, and it's like it gets real sticky. And I honestly believe the ethical argument of what are people's intentions, what are they trying to do, and what have we seen them do over and over again? I think that really plays into it. And especially for me, if I'm just looking at it from a right or is this right or wrong, I'm going to look at what have people been doing. So I want to read a few things that I found. This is the Palestinian war tactics, terrorism tactics. Okay. So obviously not everyone who would consider themselves Palestinian is a terrorist, but there are a lot of terrorist groups that are supporting this cause. So several of the Palestinian militant groups are considered terrorist organizations by the governments of the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Japan, New Zealand, and the European Union, all of those countries. So like all of these countries have recognized groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, these as being Al-Qaeda, as being, and obviously those are different groups, but it's not just Palestinian, but these are groups that are recognized terrorist organizations for a very good reason. And some of those reasons are their tactics when it comes to trying to displace other groups, especially the Israelis, but also war in general, have to do with hostage taking, plane hijacking, boat hijacking, stone throwing, IED, improvised explosive devices, knife attacks, shooting sprees, attacks with vehicles, car bombs, and assassinations. In the 1990s, groups began suicide bombing, predominantly targeting civilians, which later peaked and grew to even more suicide bombings. We've seen in the recent decades rocket attacks on Israeli urban centers, and obviously October 7th, 2023, huge massacre taking place and hostages being taken as well. So what you see is a version of war that most of the world would not just frown upon, but has determined as terrorism, and as something that is a war crime, not just war, but a war crime. And, so I think to me, I'm like, okay, so people historically, they're going to look at one version of history versus another. And obviously try to repaint history to their liking if they can, but it's like, you can't really argue with some of the ethical arguments. Now I'm going to leave room for the response, and I may come back myself if no one else responds, because Israel's hands are not completely clean. That's not what I'm trying to say. But when you look at the comparison, I think there's a very clear line there.
Ryan, do you have a point about that one? Because I do want to get into some of the history of Palestine, but I'll let you respond.
Yes,
but I want to get into some of the history that you touched on, because I think it will help us. Some of the points y'all are making is that this is not primarily an argument actually over land. Right. And I'm going to run through the history here. And I think it's pretty fascinating that we'll see that it really is not actually, even though a lot of people try to get into the land disputes, which gets really sticky, that it's actually not primarily an argument over land. And I have some proof for that, but we want to go ahead and respond to Troy.
Yeah. And so I want to talk just real 30 seconds on just war theory, but it's important for us to understand the historical significance of this. I agree. It's may not be the best argument for it, but even if we just cut everything off and go from 1948, where the international community agreed to all of this, and we just talked that forward, that would be enough for us to discuss all of that. So just war theory. So it's about how the reasons to go to war and how to conduct war. And then sometimes they add in justice after the war. So just cause, meaning that it's a real and serious threat. It could be self-defense, whatever it is, has to be a legitimate authority. Okay. So a terrorist organization is not a legitimate authority. You have to have right intention. So the aim must be peace and justice, not revenge or conquest. Okay. You have to have a probability of success. So it can't be intended to fail if it's just causing needless suffering. And you need to have a last resort. So all peaceful options must be tried and failed first, and then proportionality. So the expected good outcomes must outweigh the likely harm that could result from that war. And then you need to have, during the war, discrimination. So distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants, or civilians. Then you have proportionality again, which is using the force necessary to achieve those objectives from the military. And then you have no evil means. So no weapons or methods that are intrinsically evil, like genocide or rape or torture or IEDs, those sorts of things. So that's just kind of a primer on that. So reflect everything we've talked about. What do you see? And like you said, maybe Israel's not so clean, but
I would say I would point to a few specifics. So this is not me coming out in support against Israel at all. I support Israel, and y'all, if you listen to this whole podcast, you're going to see that very clearly and the reasons why I support Israel. But I would say I don't support. I believe that I can take the stance, even in today's controversial, you got to go all in one way or the other world. I can take the stance of I support Israel, but I don't support every single thing they do. So I'm just going to, for the sake of the arguing on the other side, I'm going to say make a couple points. First off, Israel has recently been accused of ethnic cleansing after more than 140 were killed in Gaza in 24 hours. And obviously these intensive bombings that are taking place are, from Israel's perspective, they're essentially just trying to check off that next box in their goal, right, in this war and what they're trying to do. But at the same time, people have pushed back a lot, and that's why we're seeing all the international pressures rise right now. But also, I want to point people back to what happened last year with the exploding pagers. So if y'all remember, there was that issue of the exploding pagers. And a lot of people, what I saw was a lot of people cheering and applauding, on Facebook and stuff and saying, hooray, look what they did. But if you look at the actual details of it, these pagers were distributed mainly among people allegedly associated with the Hezbollah movement, which includes civilian and military personnel. So that would be civilians. They were targeting civilians and military. The civilians were the ones that were supposedly supporting the Hezbollah, not necessarily fighting. But then also, at the time of the attacks, there was no way of knowing who possessed each device and who was nearby, is what the experts have concluded. So when you look at, it's kind of a Trojan horse situation, but when you look at it from an ethical perspective, I would say that's clearly a no-no. That's the nicest way of saying it in my mind. And it's like, I'm not trying to jump aboard, anti-Israel sentiment there or something like that. But I would say that that's an instance of something that they've done that I don't support. And I would say, I don't think that's the right way to go about it. Now, a lot of people would push back and say, well, that's small potatoes compared to what's happening on the other side. And I would agree. I would say yes. And, and I would also say there are times where your intent in war is one thing and something else happens. There's collateral damage. I would agree to that as well. But in this case, I think they crossed a line. So I think, as I'm saying, I think that's one bit of evidence for that argument that Israel's hands are not completely clean either. But at the same time, I think it's very clear that the other side, the terror tactics are a lot more popular. So
yeah, to sum up what Troy, you and Ryan are just talking about, but yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The pagers are a little bit of that pager incident with them detonating the pagers and which did kill civilians. That was a little bit of a dark stain on some of the things that Israel has done. And also, I think that's part of the international community is freaking out right now because they're like, wait, if you keep pushing so hard after Hamas in Gaza right now, is it going to lead to a famine? Is it going to lead to lots of civilians getting killed? We haven't seen that yet. I know people that say there's a genocide going on right now, I'd say are fundamentally wrong because there is and I'm going to point back to that 1-to-1 ratio. So your point, I think that was a dark stain for Israel. But again, let's compare, try to compare apples to apples here. So Israel has a 1-to-1 combatant versus civilian ratio. That actually is incredible. And I know we haven't really got into this yet, but Hamas hides in hospitals and schools and uses women and children as human shields. They purposely do that in order so that way that Israel can't shoot them, or if Israel does end up shooting them, it kills civilians. And it's twofold because then they also get to have the international community condemn Israel for killing civilians. And so when you're fighting somebody who uses civilians as a human shield, having a 1-to-1 ratio is actually that should be a badge of honor. Israel should wear that as a badge of honor of look at how much we care about human life, that for every one combatant that's killed, only one civilian is killed, which is impressive because Hamas purposely uses civilians as human shields.
Yeah.
And so you have that on that. So that's Israel. And then you have the other side, you have Hamas, which when they did their attack into Israel, they didn't land at a military base. They landed at a music festival and killed
Right.
and did unmentionables to civilians. So you have the
Right.
two different approaches here. We have we're going after combatants and we're going to try really, really hard not to kill civilians versus we're just straight up killing civilians. But
Mhm.
again, if somebody wants to say, "Hey, this Gaza thing is dangerous," I'll listen to the arguments because I think they could have something there. If there's a famine potentially starting in the Gaza area, that's going to be devastating. That's going to kill a lot of people, and so that is worth mentioning. And the pagers is worth
Yeah.
mentioning. Before we finish out this section, I'm going to try to burn through real quick a history lesson because I think this is fascinating and actually lines out a lot of the arguments and where we at, as an international community today, looking at the area that has for a long time been known as Palestine. And so let's get into this. I'm not going to go through the whole history because it would be a while, but I'm going to jump some of the highlights. So starting almost 2,000 years ago, the first couple of centuries, Rome destroyed the country of Israel because there was a Jewish rebellion against Rome. This was like in like 160 or something like that, sometime after Jerusalem was destroyed. And when they destroyed Israel, they were so tired of the Jewish rebellions. When they destroyed Israel, they purposely renamed the area Palestine. Palestine's name comes from the no longer existent, at that time, Israel's ancient enemy, the Philistines. That's where the word Palestine comes from. The Philistines weren't around anymore. The Romans named it Palestine purposely to erase the name Israel away because it was a part of destroying the country of Israel. They destroyed it and then they erased the name. And so that way the country didn't exist anymore. So that was very intentional by the Romans. However, the land, there was a lot of Jewish people had to flee and leave at that time. But there has always been Jewish people living in the area that became known as Palestine for hundreds and hundreds of years. There was always still Jewish people living there. So the land was occupied by lots of different kingdoms throughout the entire time. And it was just kind of interesting jumping forward a little bit, but to like the modern day, the name Palestine actually used to refer to anybody that lived in that area. So if you were Jewish or if you were Arab, you were a Palestinian because you lived in the area of Palestine. It wasn't actually until the 1960s that the Palestinian became like akin to a national identity for the Arabs that live in that region, that they started calling themselves Palestinians as like a core identity group essentially in that area. Before that, a lot of the Arabs considered themselves to be just an extension of Syria or extension of Jordan or just an Arab living in the region of Palestine. And so it's important to note Palestine, as we've said, or Gaza, has never actually been a country. It's never been an official country before. So this is where this gets a little sticky. So 7th century, that's when the region gets taken over by Islamic expansion, right? So a lot of the Islam control now, a lot of Arabs move in and a lot of Jewish people move out. However, if you look at, there's been recent genetic testing of both the Palestinians in Gaza and the Jewish people in Israel. And this is what's really interesting because they both have an argument of saying, oh, we were here first, or we were the predominant group, right? Well, if you do a genetic testing, which they've done recently, the Palestinians and the Jewish people are actually extremely similar genetically. They have almost the same ancestors. The reason being is because a lot of the Jewish people who were living there, a lot of them didn't leave. A lot of them actually just converted to Islam. And so you have a continual people who have been in the region for a long time. Some have stayed Jewish. Some have moved over to Islam. A lot of them left, but their ancestors were still from that area. And then a lot of them moved back. So it's fascinating because you could make the argument that both of them actually have an ancestral claim to the region because they have essentially, most of them, the same shared ancestors. However, this is something that both sides they will kind of argue against this. So pro-Palestinian people will say, well, the Israelis, this was mainly a Muslim area, and the Israelis all moved in starting in the 1800s. But it's like, okay, yeah, but their ancestors were from there. And then the pro-Israel people will be like, oh, well, the Palestinians, they're mainly from like Saudi Arabia or Syria, but that's not actually true either. It's like, again, their ancestors are from that area. Most of them, some of them, there are obviously Arabs that have moved in from Saudi Arabia and Syria, but a lot of them, genetically speaking, have ancestral claim to that area. So what's the real problem here? Okay, so let's talk about, y'all probably have heard of the two-state solution of like, why can't the Arabs and the Israelis, why can't they just, you have your country, we have our country, let's divvy up the land, call things even, call it good. So let's talk about the 5 different times that the Arabs in the Palestinian area have rejected the two-state solution on 5 different occasions. So you already mentioned this, Ryan, but in 1920, the League of Nations required England to make a Jewish state in Palestine. So they started working towards that, and a lot of Jewish people began moving back to the area. At that time, it was mostly Arabs. And then we have a lot of Jewish people moving back in, and then conflicts began to occur between the groups of people. So in order to end the conflicts, in 1936, the British offered the Arabs 80% of the disputed land. 80% of the land they offered to the Arabs and said, you can have your own country, and the Jewish people will get 20%. And the Jews said yes. They voted yes, and the Arabs rejected it. And they rejected it because they did not want a Jewish state in that area.
Yeah.
So then in 1947, the UN tried again, and the UN said, okay, we're going to create 2 states, and we're going to give this amount of land to the Arabs, this amount of land to the Jews. Again, the Jews said yes, the Arabs rejected it. So they fought a war over the land. The Jews won, and they created Israel in 1948. Then you have 1967. In 1967, the Arabs in the area, led by Egypt, joined by Syria and Jordan, they tried to destroy the country of Israel in the 6-Day War, and Israel won. So when Israel won, they claimed a little bit more land, and they claimed the West Bank. They took it from like Egypt or Jordan or somebody. And then what they did was they actually offered it to the Arabs, and they said, okay, we just claimed this new land. Arabs, if you want, Palestinians, if you want your own country, you can have it. We'll give you the West Bank, and you can have it. And they responded by saying no, and they gave 3 no's. They said no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. 2 more. The year 2000, the Israel prime minister again offered the West Bank to the Palestinian leader. He said no, and he responded by killing 1,000 Israelis in a wave of suicide bombings. In 2008, another time, a 5th time, the Israeli prime minister offered even more land than before. The entire West Bank plus more land to the Palestinians, offered, you can have your own state, you can have your own country, just leave us alone. Here it is. And they turned it down again. And so with that history in mind, I'm just curious, what do you guys think? Is peace possible in the region between the Israelis and the Palestinians? What is the real solution here? What needs to happen in order for there to actually be peace in this region?
Well, it's a very hard question to answer, Reese, but I think that summary right there that you just gave kind of hits the nail on the coffin, like puts the nail in the coffin lid, because it's like very obvious that one side wants peace and one side wants war, and wants to dominate everything, not just share, not just have a fair outcome or something like that, but rather wants to annihilate and take over the entire region, and so I think the problem is, so like I have friends who are very, very pro-Israel, and I'm pro-Israel, but I would say I don't go as extreme as they do, because I'm obviously willing to look at some of the critical arguments and stuff. But at the same time, I've talked to them, and and what they want is they want Israel to completely wipe out all of the it's crazy because it's like they say they want them to wipe out all the terrorists, but I think they include a larger group of people than just that, right? So it's like, and I'm like, man, really, that's what you want Israel to do? But it's like, the question is there any other alternative that, it's like, then one group wiping out the other where they stop fighting, and I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but it's like, I feel like there's always going to be conflict. Like, I just feel like that's the way it's going to be, like, unless they finally decide we're going to have a 2-state solution, which it doesn't seem likely since they keep rejecting it. So,
yeah, I think we've seen a lot of trying the same thing over and over, and we're seeing for the same reasons it's not working. And every time, I mean, Israel's actually given up land. I mean, they say, okay, fine, here we'll do this, and it still continues. So I think, I don't know that this would necessarily resolve it, but we should not see the international community treating it the way that they're treating this, as though it's like these 2 legitimate states coming against each other over a legitimate dispute of land. Like, I think that to me is the biggest obvious thing that is sticking out, and it's no surprise. I mean, like I mentioned, all the UN vetoes, all of these countries that are against, and the United States, and we're going to talk about this in another segment, but the United States has been pivotal to supporting Israel in the UN. And
Right.
I mean, it's and getting Israel back to being, they were one of the 3 votes that were needed that really tipped the scale to be able to have them become a nation in 1948. And so it really came down to the United States. And so, I mean, we see even our leaders today, kind of equating the terrorist actions with legitimate military operations, which is just insanity. And so for me, that's the big thing, is that just get our head out of the sand and actually look at the reality of what's happening. And then we can really talk about what should take place and what should happen. And people could say, well, Hamas was elected there. And it's like, okay, yeah, I'm sure there was no, there was no force involved in that election, I'm sure.
Right.
And so,
well, I'd like to point back to what I said at the beginning, when I made the point, like historical injustices does not excuse current injustices, right?
Yeah.
And it's like that idea of, I think people are looking at the plight of the Palestinians and arguing, well, somebody's got to, stand up for them. So somebody's got to stand up for their rights. And they're like, well, here's some terrorist organizations that are doing that. But it's like, but you can't justify terror, and you can't justify the atrocities that they commit, and the tactics that they're using, to just because you care about a certain group of people. It's like that doesn't justify any of that. And so I think that's really the word legitimate is the one you're using, Ryan. And I think that's right. It's right on point. It's like that does not legitimize. Somebody's plight does not legitimize terror. So I don't know. I think
Well, and I think that we're very quick to we are criticizing Hamas and the terrorists, and we're very quick to say, look, here's some things Israel needs to clean up, okay? And it doesn't justify, terrorism on one side doesn't justify unethical actions on the other side. And so I mentioned all the just war theory approaches, but the thing is, we see the international community, and even in the U.S. and many people at the kitchen tables, coming against Israel for certain things, and they may even be misrepresenting what Israel did, and they're very quick to do that. But not one of those people has said anything publicly against Hamas or against the terrorist attack that they did, or anything, or that maybe they should recognize Israel as a legitimate state. Mm-hmm. Like, these people who are criticizing Israel are not also criticizing Hamas and the Palestinian area, and they're not recognizing that. And so for me, that's just it's disgusting. Like, it's insanity,
It's
and
a bias.
It's a bias.
It's looking at the ethical cost through the lens of a large bias. Like, it's like if you look at it from a lighter perspective, like my sports team and the other sports team rivals got into a fight. And of course, if the other team hadn't been there, none of this would have happened. Like if they hadn't, but it's like, my team was also, swinging punches and stuff too. So it's like, but it's looking at like, okay, they're doing this wrong, but it's like, but what's happening on this side? So I think when you really try to balance it, there is no balance to it. There's no balance to the ethics on both sides. That's not saying Israel's completely, their hands are clean, but it is war, at the same time. So it's like things are going to happen, but that doesn't justify them so it's like when they're making bad decisions, like currently some of the international pressure to say, hey, let the humanitarian aid come into Gaza, or let some of the Palestinians flee Gaza, or whatever it's going on, and Trump, that's what we've seen recently. We've seen Trump, and obviously we're going to get into the politics in a second, but Trump kind of putting some pressure on Israel from that stance. I would say, depending on the details of what's going on, I would probably side with Trump in this instance, and say, like y'all need to release some of that pressure and, and let the humanitarian aid come in. Now, obviously we have the problems of the aid getting, stolen by Hamas and all that. Right. So that's a huge issue as well, and to be taken into consideration. But at the same time, I'm saying, like, I understand where some of the pressure is coming from, especially from Trump and some of the other leaders, when it comes to Israel's actions.
Yeah. To summarize, I think you're absolutely right, Ryan. It is kind of like comparing apples to oranges. And unfortunately, it does make me want to, I want to try to take a balanced approach, but I end up seeing like, wait a second, how come there is some unfair criticism of Israel happening when people are comparing like, oh, this is apples to apples. We have two legitimate countries that are just fighting over land. Where it's like, no, this is an apple and an orange. Like Israel has legitimacy, and we've shown that Hamas does not have legitimacy. And it's like, so we shouldn't be comparing these as if it was just two legitimate countries that have a legitimate land dispute, when it's like, when you get down to the brass tacks, it's actually, much more complicated than that, and ends up being, if you look through the history of like, no, we have legitimacy on one side with maybe some problems, but like something much, much worse over here with what Hamas has done. I do want to move on to American politics, unless somebody has something they're dying to.
No, let's move to American
get
politics,
into.
because we're going to have to make this section kind of short, probably.
All right. So American politics. This is, as we've mentioned, the Trump administration has maybe turned a cold shoulder to Israel, however you say that metaphor. We'll get into it. I want to hear y'all's analysis of this, but real quickly, I'm gonna talk some U.S. And Israel relations today, things that have recently happened. So just recently, the U.S. intelligence reportedly intercepted Israeli communications that suggest a potential strike on Iran. So the analysis is that Israel has a plan to strike nuclear sites in Iran, and in order to wipe out their nuclear programs in Iran, because Israel's afraid they're trying to build bombs, just as the Trump administration and the United States and lots of people are afraid that Iran is trying to build bombs, and there's evidence of that. However, the analysis is that Israel is probably going to hold off and not do it right away, because Trump is in the middle of talks with Iran about their nuclear program, and Trump is trying to get them to peacefully give up their uranium and their enrichment program, probably in return for like lowered sanctions or something else. He's trying to cut a deal with them. So that's going on right now. So it's not likely that Israel is just going to come out and be like, hey, we're going to interrupt your talks with Iran, and we're just going to like, hit all their spots. But that has been leaked recently. And so I think that's produced a little bit of tension between Israel and the United States. In fact, I saw the analysis. A lot of people believe that the security advisor, Mike Waltz, y'all might remember Mike Waltz being fired by the Trump administration. A lot of people are saying he was fired for reportedly going behind Donald Trump's back and talking to the Prime Minister Netanyahu about striking Iran and U.S. supporting that strike. So he was reportedly, if you believe the reports, in talks with the Prime Minister of Israel about those strikes, and he did that behind Trump's back. And then Trump found out about it and fired him. So if you believe that report to be true, I would say it's fair to assume that Trump does not support Israel doing these strikes. Okay, so there's that. Recently, Netanyahu asked Trump not to lift sanctions on Syria's new government. Trump lifted sanctions on Syria's new government. So that was something he went completely against what Israel wanted him to do, or Israel's leadership. Netanyahu recently had a disappointing visit with Trump recently. Troy, maybe you can talk about that, because you covered that on a live stream this week. Trump could have visited Israel when he was in the Middle East. He did not. And then J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth recently had visits to Israel that they canceled. And some believe that it's because Israel ramped up its attack on Gaza and that they canceled those events. So what do y'all think about the Trump administration? What is happening here? Is the Trump administration turning its back on Israel? Is it distancing itself from Israel? Does it have some sort of strategy for what it's doing and how it's dealing with Syria and Iran and some of these other neighbors of Israel? What do y'all think about this?
I think that Trump and the Trump administration is probably doing some sort of art of war strategy there with that. I don't think we're really turning our back on Israel. I think that most likely what's happening is for sure what's happening is there's a lot of stuff that we can't see going on behind the scenes. And I don't know, it's been a while since I've read it. I've read a lot of Art of War, but that sounds like one of those things where it's like, like make it look like your enemy is your best friend, and then your best friend is your enemy, so that you confuse everybody, so that you get done what you actually want to get done. That's what it feels like to me. Also, I would say on the Waltz thing, him getting fired, I don't think he necessarily would have been fired because Trump wasn't in support of what Israel's doing. I think that firing, if it were true, if that report is true, I think that that's going to be more related to the fact that he went behind Trump's back, regardless of what anybody was doing. You go behind the president's back to do something like that, like that's teetering on the verge of treason. Like, he's lucky that firing was all he got,
Yeah, and even just from a sense of loyalty, like Trump's big on loyalty. So even if it wasn't a treasonous action, it was a betrayal, and obviously that's the case there. I mean, I think what's probably going on, I don't think he's turned his back on Israel. I don't think it's even changed philosophically or even the international relations approach. But I think what has happened is he is what he's trying to do. And we've talked about this on other episodes, and is to have closer ties with Syria and Iran, or well, to sort of be able to have them be closer tied to the U.S. so that they have, in order to come against the U.S., they will have to act against their own interests, if that makes sense. So it's basically separating them from China and Russia, and kind of having Syria and Iran, and these all not being able to come together in partnership with all of these as this great big force. And so for me, if he had to put a little bit of distance, at least appearance of distance between himself and Israel in order for them to be able to come to the table, for me, that would make sense, so that he can get those ties together going. Now, I don't think we should have our economies tied together. I think it's only insofar as needed in order to sort of mute the potential issues we could have in the future from them partnering all together, or with China or Russia. Like, for me, that's the limit of it, because they've got huge human rights abuses that they need to deal with, especially against Christians in their nation. And so for me, that's what's going on. I think he will come back around, and there could be some pressure he's wanting to put on Israel too, to actually do things that they should be doing, and Netanyahu and what Trump wants him to be doing. So he could be using that to an advantage on both sides, not just to position himself with these other Middle Eastern nations.
I think one thing from the political perspective that's happening is that Trump ran on a pro-Israel campaign partially. That was one of his talking points. He knows that his core conservative supporters are by and large pro-Israel in a lot of ways, especially a lot of the Christian audience, a large portion of the Christian audience. Obviously not everybody, but so there is this historical U.S.-Israel ally relation that has been set in stone in a lot of ways, and obviously is pushed back against sometimes when we have liberal people in charge. But at the same time, when Israel does something that looks bad to the international community, in some ways it reflects poorly on the United States. And so I think there's part of that there where Trump is saying, hey, y'all are doing this in Gaza right now. You're not allowing the aid to come in, and you're making us look bad too. So he's putting pressure there. But I think there's also some, like we did a whole exclusive episode. So if y'all are not members on the YouTube channel, or also we're on locals.com, and those links are in the description. But if y'all want to get access to that exclusive episode, that's where you'll find that. But we did a whole exclusive episode about Syria and how that relates to what's happening in Israel, and Trump and the United States support of Israel. And one thing that's come out since then, just yesterday, the New York Post posted an article saying that Syrian leader al-Shara has said, we're open to not only recognizing Israel, but also to try and join the Abraham Accords. So that's actually really big and surprising, because historically, Syria has said we will never, there will be never any peace with Israel until it relinquishes the Golan Heights, which is this area that Syria unsuccessfully attempted to reclaim back from Israel during the Yom Kippur War in the 1970s, and that the United States, I believe it was like 2019 or so, under the Trump administration, officially declared as, no, that belongs to Israel. So there's a lot of tension there between Israel and Syria. And yet now, and I think it has direct correlation to Trump's lifting the sanctions off of Syria, making deals with Syria, becoming friends with Syria in some ways, to an extent, like you were saying, Doug. It's kind of like this idea of like we can do more together than like separate or whatever. But it's like now we see Syria saying, okay, we actually might want to join the Abraham Accords. We might want to officially recognize Israel. And even there are reports I saw yesterday from another news source that Israel is now quietly meeting with Syria about possibly joining these accords. So there's actually meetings taking place right now under the radar. Yeah. And it's so that, to me, I'm like, that's crazy. It doesn't seem like likely, but I think something like that would only come about. Now, I don't know what's going to come of it, but something like that would only be possible because of what Trump just did in Syria. So I think there's some possible pro-Israel results, that come from his trip to the Middle East.
That is fascinating. I think you guys might have just convinced me that there is a lot of strategy occurring, especially as Ryan, as you mentioned, about pulling, trying to detach Syria and Iran and some of those groups from potentially siding with Russia and China in a future conflict, or even just, it seems like the United States is uniquely positioned to try to help bring peace into the region that Israel obviously cannot do on its own. Israel's job, as far as they're concerned, is protecting our borders and trying to take out terrorist groups that are trying to come in and kill us. And
Right.
that's a really high stakes, high stress environment that would probably make it very difficult to then have like strategic, friendly international relations with the countries immediately around you that you've had problems with in the past. So it makes a lot of sense. I think it's really interesting to see, because and it's also an interesting public outcry that's occurred, because people who are really pro-Israel have already gotten upset with Trump and being like, oh my gosh, Trump snubbed Israel, and and that's real. And but then you have people that are really anti-Israel, and they're like, oh yay, Trump's not just a puppet for like this globalist Israel Jewish conspiracy. Essentially, like there's people who are really, really anti-Israel, really, really hate Israel, and are like happy that Trump has kind of snubbed them a little bit. And it's interesting to see when you break it down, there might actually be a little more going on behind the scenes than just that is. And so I think we'll have to wait and see what some of that is going to be. I do think for the sake of time, I think it's probably time to get into the spiritual Christian arguments. I'm sure we'll have a lot to say about this. And if it's okay if this bleeds over a little bit, I do want to make a point here. I think it's really fascinating, Troy. You kind of mentioned like the left-right divide. When I was looking into this and just reminded of some stuff I've seen, I think it's really interesting. In America, we have support for Israel, and we also have people that really don't like Israel. And then we have a lot of people in the middle that are just pretty indifferent about Israel, to be honest. And sometimes they're like, why are we supporting Israel as much as we do? Like, I'm fine that Israel is a country, but like, why are we supporting them? Why do we even care what's happening on the other side of the world? It was, more of the isolationist mindset. But this is not just a left-right issue, actually, because on the left, you have two groups, in my opinion. You have the successful left politicians who almost all the time, even if they pay lip service to Palestine, and even if they criticize Israel, at the end of the day, they still support Israel as an ally. I think Joe Biden is a perfect example of this. When he was president, he was working with Israel. He was supporting Israel, and he definitely supported Israel more than he supported Palestine. But he paid lip service to the other portion of his party, which is the unsuccessful political portion of the party. There's definitely a loud movement in the left that hates Israel, but they're not really successful politically. There's not very many of them that are like in positions of power. They just like to make problems and, yell at their members for not condemning Israel hard enough. So you have a split on the left and in the left. Well, the right is the same. On the right, we have neoconservatives that are like, Israel's our biggest ally and we love intervention in the Middle East. And so like, that's what we love to do. We have isolationists, and the MAGA group kind of falls underneath that a lot recently. That's like, we don't want to be at war with anybody on the other side of the world. So let's make peace. Let's pull out. Let's do whatever we can to not have this conflict going on. But then another group that we have, you also have people that just straight up hate Israel for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes it gets into a little bit of like global conspiracy stuff occurring, and whether that you think that's really occurring, yes or no. I do think sometimes that like direct hatred of Israel might be a little misplaced, but I'm open to listening to arguments. But I think the one we'll focus on the most today is the Christian group. We have a Christian group for non-political reasons, mostly, that really heavily support Israel. And so this is we're all Christians here. This isn't only a Christian podcast. This is a political podcast, but this is sort of where our faith intersects, because this is a political issue, because lots of Christians support Israel and will support them politically for spiritual and religious reasons. So let's get into that. Why does a lot of Christians, especially I'm in the United States, so I mainly know about the United States, why do a lot of Christians support Israel? What's the religious, spiritual implications behind them supporting Israel? And is that always a good thing?
So my take or my understanding of this, so I will say this is that there are many who understand the depth, the reasons why we should support Israel, and there are many who don't. And I've talked with pastors that literally they're like, well, I don't really understand the Israel stuff, and we should, that's why I don't talk about it. And I was like, there's no reason. Like, Israeliology is not something in seminaries, so it needs to be in seminaries to understand this. And so here's a quote. It says in Genesis 12:3, it says, God blesses those who bless Israel and curses those who curse it. And so I have a quote from Jack Hayford. I'll give a couple quick thoughts on that. So he says, those that bless them, Israel, those that bless them, he will bless. Those that don't come under a curse. No, Americans can be American. No American can be unconcerned about that. I don't think you have to be a believer in order to come to terms with that. Only a good student of history, and history undeniably says you don't get away with that being against Israel. So what is he referring to? Well, you have Egypt, you have Babylon, you have Nazi Germany, you have the British Empire and the Soviet Union. I can give the details of how these nations, both ancient and more modern, came against Israel. And you saw the decline, Pharaoh in Egypt. They lost their entire army coming against Israel. You saw in Babylon, they conquered Judah, destroyed the first temple, and then they were conquered by the Medes and the Persians. And so God brought judgment and justice through another way. And then you have Nazi Germany tried to exterminate the Jews. They lost World War II and was divided. And so then you have Great Britain, after promising the Jews the homeland in the Balfour Declaration in 1917, they limited Jewish immigration. And so then that outcome after that was the collapse of the empire, and they lost a lot of global influence. You have the same thing in the Soviet Union. And so the U.S. needs to continue supporting Israel. I think it's very important. But I will say this, in Zechariah 12, verses 1-14, it says that, it prophesies, all those things were prophesied. A lot of those things in there that I mentioned, you can go hundreds of years earlier and you can prove that with biblical translations and things, that those were actually prophesied, the downfall of those nations before they happened when they came against Israel. But the Bible actually declares that a time will come where all the nations will turn against Israel. And so what we're seeing today, and what we've seen over the last half century or even more, is it becomes very conceivable that could happen. And so this is why we need to be supporting Israel, because God supports Israel. And as a nation, now it's not mean we support everything that they do, the leaders, but some people try and, believe that the church replaced Israel, but it's not true. The church was grafted in. It's like when you cut part of a tree off and then you put another part of the tree on top of it. That's a grafting. And so you have the church grafted into Israel, and so in the promises of Israel. So that's my quick summary of why the church should be supporting Israel.
Yeah, I think that's a fair take on it. I would say some people would push back. You mentioned Genesis 12, 2-3. He says, I'll make you a great nation. I'll bless you, make your name great. You shall be a blessing, and I'll bless those who bless you. And the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So some people would say, in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed, was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So some people would take more of the messianic fulfillment of that prophecy view and say, when Jesus came and he brought the new covenant, he brought the gospel message and, salvation, the offer of salvation to the world, that he was the fulfillment of that, because Jesus was a Jew. And he was, like Paul, and you mentioned this, Paul talks about how the Jews rejected Christ. And then after that, the Gentiles were able to be grafted in, right, to the tree. And so there's that view. There's also the view of from religious Jews. They might say that it's all fulfilled through Israel, because those that are not Messianic Jews, that are still religious, they would say, okay, well, this still applies and it's all being fulfilled through the nation of Israel. Others believe there's kind of a mix happening. I think it all comes down to how you interpret the Old Testament law and the ordinances from the Old Testament. Because there are, if you get into like the theology behind it as a Christian, you look at, well, when you look at the Old Testament through the New Testament lens, you have to look at it through the new covenant lens. And, like Paul said, under the new covenant, the old covenant is being made obsolete, is what he says, and so it's like, and the glory that once there is no longer there because it's faded. And now there's a greater glory, which is the new covenant. So when you look at the Old Testament laws, I just had a conversation with Rabbi Kurt Schneider, and he talked about theologically the old covenant and the Levitical priesthood and the Levitical laws. Talked about how, like, as a Christian now under the new covenant, we're not supposed to, we're not legally we're not legally under the restrictions of the 613 Mosaic laws. Yet at the same time, we can still apply truths from them. We can still, use those and take the principles from behind them. But at the same time, we can learn about God through those laws and all that. So there's this idea of Genesis 12, 2-3, and I think it's a very, very, I would say it's worth investigating perspective of saying, is this fulfilled all in Jesus? Or is there a mix happening here? And I would say, if you look at it from a historical perspective, like you just did, Ryan, I would have to agree and say, yes, I believe there is. Although I would be careful in taking it to the extreme and turning it into a superstitious thing, because it's kind of like, it's kind of this idea of like, well, I didn't put an Israel flag in my yard. Is God going to curse me? It's like, no, like that's not,
Right.
that's
Or I
not what we're
criticized the
talking about
prime
here.
minister of Israel, so am I going to be cursed now? That kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
like, well, no, because if you're looking at it through the covenant of the new covenant, it says Jesus became the curse, so for us. So it's like, curses anyone who hangs on a tree. So there's this idea of, well, there's the blessing and curses under the old covenant being fulfilled through Jesus Christ. So, well, I'm not going to support Israel out of fear of being cursed because I'm not under the curse of the law,
Well,
and you could put this not into the Mosaic law, but into the law of God contained in Scripture. And that doesn't mean that I don't obey God now, but I obey God relationally, through the Holy Spirit and through what Jesus did, more so than through what's the legalistic view of looking at it in the Old Testament. But with all that said, I would say I would, as a Christian who claims to be under the new covenant, but still reading and taking into consideration the entire Bible, I would say I look at it more from the perspective of the writings of the New Testament, where Paul talks about Romans 11:11. He says, I say then, did they not stumble so that as to fall, did they far from it? Talking about the Jews, but by their wrongdoing, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. So Paul makes a very clear point where he's saying, hey, God bringing salvation to the Gentiles, to all those who are not Jews, was not God rejecting the Jews, but because he literally says God allowed this to happen to make them jealous. So there is a theological idea ingrained in the New Testament that says God has not rejected Israel. And then it says, do not be arrogant toward the branches, talking about Israel being the original branches that got cut off. But it says, but if you're arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. So now Paul is saying, hey, that these branches are not the same. What he's saying is, hey, they're not just the branch, but they were part of the root system, so they've been there.
Yeah.
Like he's making a point that, and then he goes on to say in verse 26, he says, all Israel will be saved. The deliverer will come to Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. So there's this idea that Paul's saying God hasn't given up on Israel, so we shouldn't either. And we should not be arrogant towards them. And I would take that so far as to say we should support Israel. And at the same time, Psalms 122 says, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Just like you mentioned, Genesis 12, those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. God hasn't changed his mind all of a sudden. That would be my point. God hasn't changed his mind, but the way we look at it, we've got to look at it through the lens of the new covenant, I would say. And we have to look at it through the lens of Jesus came to fulfill the law, and there is an aspect of that allows me to remove myself from the superstitious side of it, and to look at it through a perspective of, God, what do you want me as a Christian to do in support of Israel, and not to be swayed by, not to jump on a bandwagon just for the sake of jumping on a bandwagon, if that makes sense. So
Ryan, I want you to respond, but really fast. I just want to give a little bit of history perspective. I'm not going to take a side on this. I think you guys are killing it on the arguments, because what you're discussing right now is, and actually you had it earlier, Ryan, of like, wait, is Israel still important? Is God still fulfilling something through Israel, or is the larger Bible, does the New Testament basically replace the historical like nationhood state of Israel? Whether Israel is a state or not, it doesn't really matter, because you have to think, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, most of the history of the Christian church, Israel wasn't a state. And so there was not a, like, we have to support Israel as a state. However, you do see evidence of, throughout Christian history, some Christians caring a lot about the Holy Land, caring a lot. And then, of course, you have like I would not get into the Crusades, but the whole idea for the Crusades was based on the fact that they believed the Holy Land was important to God in some way. And so and that was in the Middle Ages. So obviously this has been throughout church history, but I just wanted to throw out there just for you guys a little bit. I thought this was really interesting. So today in the American church, the Protestants, which Ryan, you mentioned this, not in the recording, but behind the recording, the Protestants primarily are in support of Israel. And there was a movement that happened in the late 1800s that sort of began that, where there was like a theological shift of, oh wait, Israel is important, and the Jewish people should be able to have a homeland, and that Israel, like, we're pulling these verses from the Bible, that maybe we should be supporting this, right? Which I'll let you get into that all you want, Ryan. However, I do think it's kind of interesting. The Christian church perspective, Christians have argued about this kind of stuff for like the last 2,000 years. We have not always been on the same page. In fact, the Catholics, for the longest time, even when Israel was becoming a state, the Catholics, it was a really hard sell for them to be like, yeah, we need to support Israel as a state, because in their theology, they basically believed Israel was punished for rejecting the Messiah, Jesus Christ. They were punished, and that's why they lost their land. And they believed that that was going to be for eternity. Like Israel lost their land, and they're not going to have a country again ever again. That was part of their punishment. Like that's what the Catholics believed. And I'm not saying all Catholics believe that, but again, I was just looking into this and I thought, oh, that was interesting because when the Protestant movement was moving and saying we need to support Israel, the Catholics were like, what the heck? Like, we don't support this. Like, we believe that the Jews, they lost their homeland. That's what God wanted to happen. So like, we don't think we need to like support them to have a homeland again. And so it's throughout church history, we've always had these arguments of like, is there something still special about Israel, or has that all been fulfilled? So I just wanted to put a little bit of context there, because sometimes I think evangelicals in America can think like the church has always thought this way, when it's not actually true. A large part of this pro-Israel movement kind of began in the 1800s. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying it's unbiblical. I think there's lots of biblical support for it, but it's just an interesting point. So Ryan, you want to destroy all of Troy's arguments?
Well, no, I think that I'm going to sort of add to his arguments and clarify a couple things that'll kind of tie some of this together, I think. But I do want to say, in the 1800s, so Darby in the 1860s, William Blackstone, Schofield, D.L. Moody, they all set the stage for the rebirth of Israel. And they were the ones that got in to push the U.S. government to be going this direction. And that was with their theology in the 1800s. And they talked about that Israel needed to be reborn before Jesus would return. And so like they literally understood that. And that's for the biblical prophecy. And that's what they were talking about. And that's what led. And then I said, they came the president, then nothing happened. A decade later, they came again. And so that's just kind of one thing, is that like theology matters. And so that's important. But I would say, I do think it's important though to like the minimum we should be doing for Israel is praying for the people of Israel. Like that's for sure. That's what we should be doing, and be for them, not just 100% against them. And so, but I do want to clarify about the laws. So 613 laws, those are broken down into the ceremonial law, the civil law, and the moral law. And so I don't know if you got into this with Rabbi, but the moral law, of course, applies today. Like there, you can't steal, you can't murder, you can't, these sorts of things. Like there's a moral law. There's a ceremonial, which was related to the cleansing and the priesthood and how you could come to the temple and those sorts of things. And then you had the civil law. And so some of those things even come through to today, but the punishments are not the same. And so there's, these all come out of the character of God. I mean, they're showing something about God and the nature of God. And so as Jesus fulfilled and interpreted the law and all of these things, and so it doesn't, in the Greek and the Hebrew and the way this is talked about, we say, it negated or makes it obsolete and all this in a sense, and so then we have to understand the full of that term in the Greek that's being used by Paul. And so what I'm saying is that it doesn't mean, we just reject all of this, everything in the law. And so what it means is that we understand that there are these principles that sort of transcend those things. And some of those, like the moral law, like Cain killing Abel, was wrong before the law came. Like that, okay, well, that was a moral thing, And so right. I know you're not saying that. What I'm doing is clarifying so that people don't hear something you're not saying is what.
Well, I would push back again, Ryan. I think you and I disagree a little bit on this issue, and this is a topic for another time. So I agree mostly with what you're saying, but I've done a lot of study in this area, and I think there's probably a little bit of a delineation here. But as far as this topic goes, I don't think that that delineation matters much. I'm going to jump back to Zechariah 14. I know you mentioned Zechariah chapter 12, because when it comes to some of the prophecies from not just the New Testament about Israel, like Revelation and stuff, but also the Old Testament as well, the prophecies still 100% apply to what's happening and what's going to happen. Many people consider Zechariah 14 to be an end times prophecy, not just I know some of the prophecies people say were fulfilled with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, all that kind of stuff. And maybe some people say there's a parallel happening. Some of the prophecies were fulfilled, then, and also at the end of time or whatever, so it depends on your perspective. But I would say Zechariah 14 seems fairly clear. It says, I will gather all the nations to Jerusalem to fight against it. And then that's verse 2. Verse 3 says, then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations. So I would say from a spiritual perspective, I want to be on the side that God's not fighting against, If God's saying, all right, all the nations are going to come against Israel at some point, and God's going to fight against all the nations, for Israel, then I'm like, all right, at that day, I want to be on the right side. So I would say from a prophetic perspective there, from the Old Testament, I would say, and spiritual perspective, that there's definitely a argument to be made for supporting Israel, and fighting on the side that God is fighting on. But yeah, anyways, I think that's all I got. So Reese, anything else you got before we wrap up?
No, not too much. I did want to give Doug a chance to chime in if you have something for this discussion, but I'm just listening to Ryan and Troy right now and being like, yeah, this is a really fascinating discussion, but
Yeah,
I can wrap us up unless you have something, Doug.
I just say something real quick. I think that you can, like, one of the questions that you had for this last little section was like, do we support Israel? Basically, like, how does that work? And I think that it's possible to support Israel without, like Troy, what you've been saying, without supporting every single thing that they do. And I just want to point back to the fact that, like, every single people group can do something good and can do something evil. And just because Israel's doing something doesn't mean you have to support it. And it doesn't mean you're going to get cursed by God either. I mean, look at Jesus even said to the Pharisees straight to their face, like, you're of your father, the devil. So it's like he made that distinction that it is possible to be part of God's chosen people and decide not to be. And we see that example throughout history with any people group, really. So I just think that it's important to make the first thing first, and that first thing is God. If you have a good relationship with God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit, then you're going to know whether or not you can support certain things from Israel or whoever, because you have the Holy Spirit talking to you. If you have the Holy Spirit talking to you, you've got the direct connection. You know the answers. You don't have to question it from a historical perspective or anything like that. You've got the direct source. So that's what my encouragement would be for anybody who's questioning it.
Love it. Really, really good insight. Ryan, you had one more thing.
Yeah, I was just going to say that conflict in this area of the world, between Gaza and Israel, is nothing new. And so if you actually look in the Bible, Gaza is mentioned around 20 times in the Bible. So if you hear Canaanites, you hear Philistines, you hear Samson, you hear Goliath, all of these, Gaza. That is the region of the world. And so constantly terrorizing the people of Israel is nothing new. Like, that is something that has been happening from that region. Just look at the Philistines and what David did. And so this is history. I mean, this is not like some made up thing for a Bible cartoon. Like, this is the actual history. And so that's just something, Judges, Genesis, Amos, all throughout the Bible, we have this happening in that region. It's a very central region. And so it makes sense to pay attention to it and just be aware of it. Like, this is not a new phenomenon. This is nothing new. This is exactly what's been happening for centuries.
Yeah.
That was one of the circular reasoning arguments. You just make me think one more thing. When I was doing the research and stuff and looking at, like, secular historians and stuff, one of the arguments of circular reasoning was, well, the Israelis came in, the Jewish people came in, and they took out the people in the land in like 1400 BC. And so somebody else was there before them. They were. And so we should give it back to the people that were there before. And I'm like, oh, you mean in that mythological book that you're always talking about? Like that you're getting the history from that myth, It's in the same article, they go, oh yeah, the Bible's also a myth, and it's like,
well, hold on. The Bible is a myth.
What?
The Bible is a myth.
The certain definition. I don't think we have time to get into that, Doug.
Yeah, well,
you're going to offend a lot of people unless you have a lot of time.
I think we have a different definition.
Yeah, no, what I'm saying is they're using the term myth to say it's not true, and then they're also saying they're pulling parts out of it that they want to be true for the sake of their argument. So it's just like circular reasoning. Anyways.
Maybe you were just joking, Doug. I don't know. I can never tell if you're joking or not.
I know. I do that sometimes. I am kind of joking, but I'm not at the same time. The Bible is a myth according to the actual main definition of myth, which does not mean faith.
Okay, now we're going to get into the...
All right. Well, I'm going to wrap this up. Well, this is a good discussion. Before we get off talking about the what the Bible is and what the Bible isn't, but which, of course, we all believe the Bible is true. However, I did want to make one last point just to sum this up for you guys. This is really incredible discussion. I think it's something that the church should continue to discuss when they're talking about, are we supporting Israel? And then not just are we supporting Israel, how do we support Israel? Does that mean that we just pray? Does that mean that we put political action, that we pressure our politicians to support Israel? That's a big question. It's a question that the church needs to continue approaching. I think y'all made a great point that no matter how you really look at it from the Bible and what your what the secondary theological discussions is around Israel and around these different things, it's really difficult to come away from the Bible and the Christian faith and not at least say, in some way, the Jewish people and also Israel is important to God. And we have these principles, either direct commands or at the very least principles telling us that we should be praying for Israel. We should be supporting them at least in some capacity. And so I think that's really interesting. I think that's where a lot of Christians are, but I do want to give one small word of warning, which is just that I think sometimes in the Christian world, people can get really into eschatology where they're like, these things have to happen before Jesus comes back. And then once they be like, so we have to do this, this, and this. And it's like, okay, hold on a second. Like, obviously we can't cause everything to occur just by our own ability. Like if God wants certain things to occur, then that's kind of more up to him. And I'm just hesitant when people when people just get really dogmatic and be like, you have to support Israel in these certain ways or else you're not a real Christian. It's just like, wait a second, that's not actually core theology. It's not core to the Bible. It's definitely not core to the New Testament. And so let's just make the first things first, like Doug said. Let's be gracious. Let's pray for Israel. But let's also be led and intelligent and dig into these discussions as far as like what that extends to. Philadelphia will now be 3 hours. Yeah, we're going to talk about the entire Bible and
just throw the bomb in there. Let's go.
And
I cleared my schedule. I got time.
It's going to turn into a 3-hour discussion. Well, thank you guys so much for joining in. Catch us again tomorrow morning when we'll be giving the headlines, and next Thursday, we'll be giving another rousing hour discussion about something, maybe the Bible, probably something political. But all right, y'all have a blessed day and catch you next time.